Wachig Miswe, Kitchiminenden, Ebechi, Quechimogoyan Chibichime Hetak, Pihtabeg Nochin, Giutanochtehe, Omashkego Kinenok. So my name is Shannin Metatawabin, and I've been in the Indigenous economic development sector for more than 30 years. I started as a business development officer giving out financing to Indigenous entrepreneurs. And I carry my approach stems from my dad. My dad and Mr. McCue's dad are friends. My dad went to Trent University, and Harvey McCue used to be the professor there. So we've known each other for a long time. And my mom laughs and she says she's known him since he was 6 months old. So our families go back a long way. And essentially it's the first sort of university that created an Indigenous program to start, so Indigenous people can start educating themselves. Because I'll go through some slides on here. I've got quite a bit. I don't want to overwhelm you, but I want to give you a taste of economic development and what we've experienced, why we're sort of in the situation that we are in, what we're in the process of trying to achieve, and I call it Indigenous prosperity. And I tell Canada every time I speak at any sort of events that there's no prosperity for Canada without Indigenous prosperity, because it's been going one way too long. And now we really need to change the narrative on it all. And I'm really looking for you as allies to tell that story, to ensure that there's an understanding of both sides of the story before the story is contemplated. Even create some connections so that you can really seek out those that can tell the story, to tell it right. There's not any one person that's designated as a spokesperson, so it's really up to you to pick and choose who can try to round out that story. So my dad is Edmund Metatawabin, and he wrote a book called Up Ghost River, and it was his story of attending residential school, because he ensured that he didn't go down the one path that you would go after sitting in an electric chair, being forced to eat your own vomit, which he was forced to do when he went to residential school, and he talks about that. He went down the red road. So in learning about his culture, learning about our spirituality, making sure that his kids went to school, making sure that we were raised in the right way. And then so I'm doing that in turn to my kids. So he's an Order of Canada, he was an author, actor, and an advocate. So he's been doing this all his life, and he was a chief of our community for many years. So I lived their legacy. This is my grandfather, and this is a picture I took when we went on a trip, probably back in the 80s or the early 90s, before I came here actually. Right before I came here, that picture was taken. And I played football here, yes, and I took political science and economics here a long time ago. And it was just so nice to walk around here and just see all the differences. It hasn't really changed that much, just some new buildings and stuff like that. But the one thing that my family has instilled in me is this worldview of Kwachi. Kwachi in our worldview means the health of your neighbor determines the success of your future. And now this exists in other cultures from around the world, where there's the capitalist mentality of achieving and being successful onto your own doesn't really exist. You won't be successful in that sense unless you make sure that your neighbors are also successful, because it's a community that needs to be successful. The whole community needs to be healthy before there's really any success. And I think you can see the world right now and the economy right now. I kind of surmise it to sort of that mentality of everybody after themselves. So you see in the middle class getting smaller and smaller, and the top 1% getting bigger and bigger. So it's not working, right? Our community is very much more of a cooperative style economy where we ensure that the community is successful, albeit there's a lot of trauma in our communities, and there's a lot of reasons for that, and we're trying to work our way out of that. This is just a picture of my family. So the organization that I represent is the National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association. Now I'm gonna rip through some of these slides. I just want to give you a taste, and if there's something that you really want to come back to and ask me questions for, that's where I'd like to spend my time, because really what I want to do is instill in you a little bit of interest in our community so that you can tell the right story, and that it interests you enough to maybe tell more stories. And I hear that you're going to be going into the communities and telling stories, so that's going to be a good thing. But the beginning, the narrative so far, when we were colonized, was that nobody lived in this land. That gave everybody the justification to take over our land. And that narrative has been told many times. And it's still within books right now that you'll see that we didn't arrive more than 12,000 years ago across the land bridge that they keep on talking about. But there's more and more evidence that shows that we were here beyond that. So more than this 20,000 years ago, they found footprints, which means that we were actually here earlier than that. So this whole narrative that nobody was, like you weren't here that long so we could take your land, that sort of narrative is dying. There's a mini, it's contemplated that about 90% of our population died off with the diseases at the beginning. And the early explorers that went through the Amazon sort of confirmed that. They had pyramids, cities, millions and millions of people. When they first went down, when they went down the second time 100 years later, there was nobody. Everything's overgrown. You've seen pyramids that are covered up, and they're still finding them to this day. So there was a massive die-off, and the forest just grew right up, and it sucked the carbon out of the air, and there was a mini ice age. So there's scientific proof that there was a lot of people here, upwards of 90 million people is what they contemplated for North America. And that's our narrative. That's my narrative. The other stories are still being told, right? They'll always resist that story. But the papal bulls is something that was recently rejected, and the Pope actually rescinded it. But that's what gave everybody justification just to take people from their lands, take their goods, all at will, based on some justification back in the past. Even Canada was based on the papal bulls. All the treaties were written, all the legislation was put into place based on this assumption that they could just take our land. So our narrative is our land was stolen, and we will keep on telling that story. And there's a number of other acts, and the biggest one is the Indian Act, which I wanted to show you. The Indian Act, this is a piece of legislation that is called the Indian Act. It's probably the most racist piece of legislation that's there. And that's there just to ensure that we are wards of the state. We have a number, the government's responsible for us. We don't own anything. We don't own land. We don't own nothing. So this whole thing about putting us onto reserves was based on this Indian Act. 634 reserves all across the country, essentially apartheid, putting you on a piece of land, which is a little postage stamp, all throughout where there's really not good land, and you sink or swim, right? And to this day, there's about $350 billion needed for housing, for clean water, for all these things that every municipality enjoys. It doesn't exist on the reserves. And some communities are starting to modernize their systems to start raising taxes and pay for things, because sustainability, it's not happening. It's just going to get worse. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give this to you so that you can read it at your leisure. I'm going to give it to your professor so that he can share it with you, because I told Duncan I want to put everything in here just so that you guys have a good sense of everything, because I want to call it like Indigenous Prosperity 101, so that anybody can take this and I can share it with other people, actually, so that everybody gets a little bit of understanding. But we are viewed as wards, and it just essentially gives the Department of Indian Affairs the ability just to control our lives. And we had Indigenous agents in our communities up until, what, the 70s? Like, there's even early 80s, so that we had people that were our chiefs, non-Indigenous, running our lives. It still exists to this day in the form of third-party managers, but it continues, because there's 634 tiny communities that all consider themselves nations, but ideally, back in the past, there are 60 nations. So the governments should be really 60 governments all across the country, not 634. It really creates this whole divisive process where everybody's fighting each other. And it was set up for that, for failure, right? Only 1% of the Indigenous Services Canada money goes to economic development. So there's no long-term planning of sustainability for our communities. It's essentially setting us up to fail. They don't want us to succeed. They recently just allowed us to hire lawyers back in the 60s and vote back in the 60s. So before that, we were not able to organize. Back in the 1800s, some of our communities were actually actively in farming, but then they outlawed the use of farm machinery, given shovels. They split up our lands into Swiss cheese so that nobody can have enough land to actually have a farm. So anytime we tried to get ahead, policies were put into place to ensure that we remained where we were. So NACA, there's 58 Indigenous financial institutions. So if you guys know the Business Development Bank of Canada, Business Development Bank of Canada was created after the Second World War. Now it was created to jumpstart the Canadian economy. There were tax incentives, there were grants, there were training initiatives, there were all kinds of entrepreneurial courses and classes and all kinds of money thrown at development in Canada. And there was a whole bunch of offices all throughout the country. And this was in place until the 1970s, and it would change names about 3 or 4 times, but they had unlimited access to the government of Canada. Whenever they needed money to lend out, they lose that money, okay, get some more. They had that opportunity. In the 70s, they centralized everything, and now the Business Development in Canada has been efficient and is very influential, and they have about $36 billion. We were never given that real opportunity, but we did create financial institutions that are small financial institutions that give out business loans. That's how I started my career. I give out programming for entrepreneurs, work with entrepreneurs, and I helped about 250 to 300 Indigenous entrepreneurs back in 20 years ago. And now I'm back as a CEO. And so in the last 7 years, I've been really getting the narrative for Indigenous prosperity going. Because if Canada wants a future with Indigenous people in a better situation, we have to help them with their own businesses, have them participate in the economy, because the impact on the community is actually is happening quite a bit. We've issued about 53,000 loans. Annually, we probably do about 1,500 loans, 125 million a year, but we've never had access to capital. And then I'm just going to show you some of the successes that we've had. Some of the socioeconomic indicators, 50% in childcare. I think I changed all these, but 50% of kids in care right now are Indigenous. So some of the socioeconomic indicators are just going through the roof. Incarceration rates, we're 25%. I think they're approaching 30% right now, are Indigenous people in prisons. So all of the policies and things that have been perpetuated on Indigenous people is manifesting in exactly what they wanted. Our people are killing themselves, and they don't see any hope in the communities. The communities are essentially mini prisons because there's a boundary on it, and they've bought into the fact that that's their home, and really they were set up to be mini prisons to separate themselves from the economy, get out of the way, and they're growing from that right now. And I know there's going to be questions coming from that. We have the United Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous People that affirm the rights to land, institutions. We need our own institutions. NACA that I represent is our own institution. It's made from our community to provide financing to business. There's a book Bill Gallagher wrote called Resource Warriors and Resource Reckoning. It highlights 300 court cases, and this is what I always talk about when I talk in front of people, is that there's 300 court cases that affirm our rights and title. Because before this, resource companies and major projects just happened without consulting Indigenous communities, even though it's on their lands, and they affirm that is their lands originally because it was stolen. So 300 court cases say that you have a duty to ensure that you include Indigenous people within projects because they do have rights and title to their lands. And I think international, multinational corporations are starting to see that you have to engage Indigenous communities. Recently, they just announced a loan guarantee program to ensure Indigenous communities can buy equity ownerships into major projects. That's one tool to ensure that projects will happen in the future because Indigenous communities are that it creates uncertainty of projects. And in order for foreign investment to come back to Canada, we need more certainty. So the government's finally getting the message. So that's a good thing. I wanted to show you this image. This is what I used to use. Indigenous community, we have a lot of challenges. Economic development, skills, health, education, infrastructure, laws, all kinds of things that we don't have our things together, our planning, our institutions. We don't have a lot of coordination. So we're in the process of putting everything together, like creating a boat, and we have visions of sustainability. When everything is together and we're in the ocean of the economy, we're actually participating. So I show this because people don't really understand that Indigenous people we have so many challenges that doesn't allow us to participate. So we need to put these tools and these systems together to ensure that we can participate. This exists in other parts of the world, so it's the same idea. I just want the indicators. 30% of our loans go to women. I think it's increasing pretty quick, which we just launched an Indigenous women's program. 18% owned by youth. So I'm creating a new program for youth right now, and I always know that when you create a specific program targeting a specific demographic, it succeeds because they're like, oh, you're looking at us. Okay, we're going to come. So that's what we're working on right now. Right now, I'm asking the government for about $100 million a year. That allows these 58 financial institutions to deploy the capital that they need and work with all entrepreneurs that they need to work with. Right now, we've seen a decline by 70% in the program that used to exist back in the 90s. So it's been a steady decline in supporting Indigenous entrepreneurship. So it's going in the wrong direction. Some of the things that I wanted to show you that we've done in the last 7 years. So I'm changing the narrative, right? So we have a forum. This brings together the thinkers, the government, the partners, the social impact investors, to bring them all together in one spot so that everybody knows each other. We have a Dawe Business Hub. So it's over on Somerset and Bank. I invite you to go in there. It's just to the right. That's my office. I have a 3-story building right across from a really nice restaurant, but there's a hub. It's to help Indigenous entrepreneurs start their businesses. We have a podcasting studio in there, resources. We're hoping to connect it to other hubs. I saw the one downstairs in the business center. There's a hub right there, Innovation Center. So these are some of the things we're putting together in place so that there's more thought to entrepreneurship as an option. Financial literacy board game and online, that's a new thing that I'm rolling out. I'm doing a national impact study to ensure that we all understand how much Indigenous people provide to the Canadian economy right now. Nobody has a sense of what we spend or what we are spending into the economy as far as GDP. So this is a study that I want to make sure that we understand so that we can really show and highlight what we are providing to the economy without the supports in place. Now, we'll do another measurement in so many years after we've got the right things in place. For the first time ever, we created an Indigenous Growth Fund. So this is an institutional grade investment tool that allows private sector to invest in our community. We created it at NACA. We've got $153 million that's already been invested. If we can deploy that, then we have investors already lining up to put more money because that's putting their money into our communities and they all make money from it. So it's creating a system, right? And it's always been a big issue to have access to capital. We're also launching an Indigenous procurement organization. In Australia, they've had this Indigenous specific procurement organization helping government contracts with businesses or corporate contract with business. So we're doing that in Canada. So just sort of aligning with everything that we should have in place. These are some of the impacts. You guys can look at that at your leisure. These are some of this is kind of my planning that I did when I first started back in 2017, looking at what is the big problem, what's going on, what is lacking in Canada. So these are some of the common themes that came out. Access to capital has always been an issue, so we put together a tool that allows us to have access to capital. An Indigenous development strategy. So we did a study. It's going to be one of the other things. Procurement program, a procurement institute. So we're actually putting into place all the things that they said that we needed. Reconciliation action plans are going to be a more common thing that you're going to hear in the future. That's essentially a company highlighting in a reporting, like ESG or whatever you want to call it, a reporting of how many Indigenous people do they have working for them, kind of training that they provide, awareness training, how many procurement opportunities they provide. So it's just a sort of a social impact indication report. So I'm hoping to make it more common in the future. I'll let you guys read those at your leisure. This is the National Indigenous Economic Strategy. NIEstrategy.ca is where you can find that. There's 107 calls to prosperity. Kind of like the TRC report, leading the initiative to collectively bring together Indigenous organizations in Canada. I've had a business circle for a number of years now, but we're formalizing it into an actual organization. We're going to call it the Indigenous Economic Council, National Indigenous Economic Council, but there's a number of organizations that need to work better together. They need to coordinate their efforts, not duplicate services, save money, work together, have one common strategy. So this is what we're working on next. So that's going to allow a little bit of a change in the future, hopefully. We can only do what we can. So this is that National Procurement Organization. So we got a number of Indigenous organizations working together to launch a new organization. I have a TikTok, Instagram, and LinkedIn. You might have seen me earlier. I did a TikTok of Duncan. It was for my wife's page called Migasoo Words, which is basically providing wisdom, nuggets of information for the youth of tomorrow, and it's sort of to empower everybody. And as you get more people telling their perspectives on their lives and what made them successful, then we like to get that out to the community. Mine basically follows my journey to prosperity. All the meetings I go to, presentations I make, I like to make sure that I share that with our community so that they can see themselves in what we do. I remember my dad said that it was Senator Gladstone back in the 50s and 60s. He was a senator with Canada, and he was an Indigenous guy. He was basically advocating for Indigenous participation in the economy back then. So he was instrumental in launching the Indigenous financial institutions, making sure that the government of Canada knew that that was an important initiative. And I think the first financial institution was back in Alberta, where he was from, and taking advantage of the Suncor oil development and making sure that Indigenous people were participating in that. And my dad said it was important for him to see somebody that was participating and successful in that way. That way he can see himself into that. So I think a lot of what we do is to ensure that the next generation, and your generation, is able to participate and help and understand. So another book I'd like to recommend is Reconciliation Manifesto. That digs into some of the legislation and the history of the Indigenous community, and speaks to some places that we can move towards to improve. But I'd like to open it up for questions at this point, because I covered quite a bit in there, and you guys can look at that at your pace. But I understand you guys are into storytelling, which is great. It's, the story of Indigenous people is back when my dad was trying to get a loan, he got a lot of no's. Luann Stallway from Alberta, she had a cattle farm, and just to give you an idea of a story, she had 100 head of cattle, and she inherited from her dad, and so they've been cattle farmers all their lives. But in the Indian Act, Section 89 doesn't allow you, because we don't own any land, to put up any assets in order to securitize a loan. So Indigenous people never were able to get loans. It's essentially why we started this network, is because we don't settle too much on the security aspect of the loan. We go based on social understanding of our community. We're so good at it, 97.7% of our loans are repaid. It's probably some of the highest in the world, because we know the cousin, the brother, we've seen them grow up. So they make good business decisions and good decisions on who to give a loan to at those board meetings that they have in our communities. But Luann, she approached about 4 or 5 banks, and every single one of them said no. It wasn't until she went to the Indian Business Lending Organization in Alberta that she got a yes, and she was able to get her $200,000 to buy additional cattle, and then she just grew her business from there. But our history is a series of no's. I remember my dad telling me that he was eventually able to get his loan based on a relationship with the manager, because there's all kinds. We receive all kinds of discrimination just because of historical, the Canadian narrative of what they tell you in the books that you guys have read. But those things are now being rewritten by our own people in our perspectives, which tells a better story, I believe. And I think in the future, I think more people will be more aware. But I'll open it up for questions. Yes?
I was wondering, just based on your work and I guess the work that NAC is doing and the trends that you follow, is there much difference in, I guess, the trends or needs of economic needs for communities across the country, or are they all more broad in terms of like province to province and territory?
Well, I believe, like, if you go, the further west you go, the more active communities are. And I think that's some of our more of our lending is happening out west because they're more active. But because each of the communities have different varying levels of trauma that they've experienced, from residential school, from the amount of money that the government provides, to the cycles of violence going in their communities, whether it's, you know, chiefs and councils that are perpetually changing, because they created a system where you're basically in a prison, and you have families fighting over who's going to be the lead of the little bit of money that the government puts there. So they keep everybody busy doing that. So to contemplate anything outside of your reserve, it's non-existent for a lot of communities. So it's the more active ones, the ones that have already experienced and developed and probably built up some of the capacity of their members to go to school, to have businesses, to participate. Those ones are more active, I think, out west, but they're all across Canada. But there's varying levels, and I think that with the advent of technology, sharing, the events that people go to, building up of your connections, I think a lot of them are moving quickly. So in the future, I was talking with Duncan about this, we're going to have a new challenge, and that is managing our wealth. That'll be something in the future. But as more communities are participating in major resource projects, having bigger businesses, and members having their own businesses, there's going to be a lot more money that's going to be coming into the community when they've historically been in poverty all the time. So, but that's in the future, and I look forward to that. And those kind of challenges, I think we'll get through those as well, but I look forward to that. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
How do you sort of like balance like providing for like really immediate needs, like, you know, not being poor, with like not like perpetuating the system that like impoverished Indigenous people in the first place? Because like, you know, like, because like the economy here, you know, it comes from like colonialism, and it still has like characteristics, like neo-colonial characteristics. So like, you know, like do you ever see some like conflict in that, and like what's, I don't know, I just want to know like your perspective on it, I guess.
Well, I think I spoke in Paris at the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. They have 80 countries that are part of that collective. And I basically said that Indigenous people want to be part of prosperity. It's our lands. All of Canada, they lay claim to it. And we've never been participants in the sharing of that wealth. But yet the colonizing world has become very wealthy because of the natural resources that come from our lands. So there's been a natural capital erosion of all our territories, but there's still a lot of resources out there. They're just putting their foot in the sand, saying there won't be any more taking of our lands without us participating. So you're seeing a lot of that change where communities will now start to be active participants in the economy, whether it's individuals, economic corporations, which is the fastest growing business in our communities, economic corporations that do business on behalf of the people, not so much like cooperatives, but I'm trying to push that narrative because our communities are more cooperative. We should be operating like more cooperatives. But it's an ongoing thing where we're changing that perspectives. Like, I got to say that there's a lot of trauma in our communities, a lot of lateral violence, a lot of things going on in our communities. It's going to take a lot of time. My dad said it's taken us a long time to get us to where we're at. It's going to take a long time to get out of that and get back rolling, but we're going to navigate that as we go. I remember a question over here.
Oh yeah, I was going to ask, so you mentioned that Indigenous financial institutions are different from other learning institutions in that you have a lower loan loss rate.
Yeah.
And you better know how to assess loan risks because you know the communities. I was wondering if there's any other differences in how you operate from colonial financial institutions that help you succeed.
I think it's how our communities have taken ownership of those financial institutions, like a cooperative. We have community members from all the communities it serves sitting on the board. So everybody that utilizes the service and takes out a loan, they're doing it because they know that the benefit goes back to their community, and that's why they're utilizing it. They've just not been, like, all the spectrum of lending is not there right now because of access to capital issues. But as they grow and build up their capacity and their management systems to handle larger and larger loans and sort of manage the risk of, the losses, then they're going to be able to do more. But it's the deep social connections that allow them to make those good decisions right now. Yes.
I read that you refer to yourself as an advocate for economic reconciliation, and I was wondering if you could just break down that term of economic reconciliation.
I'm not a big fan of reconciliation, I got to say. It's a co-opted term. Everybody uses it for everything. I like to use my dad's term of reclamation, which is reclaiming our economies. Because prior to contact, we had trade routes. There's all kinds of stories, and you can dig into this of a lot of trade happening all across North America, from the mining that actually happened in BC, going all the way across North America, and then the highway system that went from Pueblo all the way north. There was intricate trading that used to happen. So we did have an economy. It's when we had a massive die out. We had 90% of our population die off. There's a massive growth. Colonization and contact really disconnected us from our economies. And my grandfather, I showed you, he was an original trapper. That was his economy. He raised 11 kids with trapping alone. So he's been an entrepreneur all his life, and that's what I was raised at. My grandma ran a restaurant. My dad runs a lumberyard right now, and he does that more for fun than anything, because he likes to write books and do all kinds of academic stuff. But we're very entrepreneurial, and I totally forgot the question. Yeah. Oh, reconciliation. Yeah. There's all kinds of terms, but I think that the Prime Minister uses that just to instill a sense that we're trying to do something in a certain area, and we're trying to reconcile from our past. But our community doesn't like that word, because reconciliation is basically it's a church term to come back to your religion, right? And we're not big fans of that, I don't think. Anyways, my family isn't. Your question?
I was going to ask what kind of the key sectors of investment and growth are within Indigenous communities in Ontario right now?
Well, I think we started in the service industry quite a bit, right? Anything that a small community would need. And what we're seeing is a transformation into larger enterprises. And with this guarantee program, I could see that a lot of communities are going to be into mining, into logging, into resource sort of major projects, and maybe renewable energy projects. I see a lot of them going on, and as they're able to access more money, then they're able to participate more actively. So I could see it going from service to technology, because there's a lot of technology businesses too. One of my first businesses I supported was Big Soul Productions, and they basically transformed the film and television industry for Indigenous people, because they trained about 500 support staff, and they created their own association, and they just grew from there. So they're creating our own production for our people from our perspectives. So it's every sort of sector is being supported right now. Yeah.
I was wondering, how can reporting on Indigenous economies contribute to a public understanding and awareness, and in what ways can it foster a respectful discourse?
I think that by ensuring that there's a good understanding of both sides of the story, and understanding a little bit of the history, because this narrative that is perpetuated on the public that Indigenous people never really owned the land because of all this legislation and treaties that were signed. Well, all those things were done in a way that basically made everybody feel a right to steal the land. So that's really what the real narrative is. So if we can show that there's a need to, if we're going to say reconcile, the histories by including Indigenous people within the economy, because we make 5% of the population, but 50% of our kids are in care. Like that's not right. Nobody's going to feel good about saying we're number one in wellness indicators in the world, but Indigenous people are 73rd. that makes no sense within one country. So you can never feel good about telling the story of Canada while not telling the story of another segment within Canada. And I think that's been done too long. So if we can just say that it's high time now Indigenous people enjoyed some of the benefits of their land by creating their economy and being healthier and paying for everything. And you had a question in the back?
I'm curious about young people, if you have a sense of what their feeling is about the future of their economy, Indigenous economy, and if there are kind of any projects targeted towards them particularly, like maybe just starting businesses or?
Well, they make up about 20% of our lending. I don't think we give enough focus to Indigenous youth. I used to be on Indigenous Youth Council way back in the day, so I used to be a youth, and I was a really big advocate, and I'm still a big advocate today. I'm a big advocate because that is our future, and we got to take them from their feeling of hopelessness, stuck on the res, seeing the politics and the needs of the community and the cycles of violence. We got to change that story because it still exists today, and it's still happening in our community. And I dislike to think that I can't do anything about that. But I can't put all the rocks on my shoulders, but I can do what I can do in my way, which is try to change the narrative for economic development and to ensure that we have nations who want to be successful, that they have the tools there to be successful. So that's kind of the things that I'm trying to do to support youth. And I'm going to be launching a youth program as well. That'll be micro lending. It'll be maybe a summer kind of jobs. And that's how I started. I got some ice cream trucks and I started selling ice cream when I was young. And it was just a small little loan. You need to plant the seed in any way you can. So we're gonna try to do that. You had a question here, yeah.
I was wondering, I learned a lot about incorporating sustainable business practices. I know the Indigenous Entrepreneurship Program at Carleton really teaches and enforces that. In your experience, could you give us an example of like a sustainable, successful Indigenous startup or business that's done well over the years?
An example of a sustainable startup business. I can give you examples of like Big Soul Productions. Since they started 20 years ago, they've split into two different companies, and they're still doing the work today. They're still creating, what's that newest show? Did you guys hear about the movie where it's Jennifer Bademski?
Little Bird?
Little Bird.
Yeah.
So Little Bird. So she's telling a story about her own story. I think she was raised in a Jewish home, and so she's Indigenous. She was children in care, raised in another family. So that is a good example. She continues to tell stories, and I know that Laura Milliken, she's getting into more motion pictures, longer stories, and movies, and I think that's something that we're actually going to start seeing more in the future is the movie telling. But I think we try to support every Indigenous business, and we went through this pandemic, and we delivered a lot of government programs to support those businesses that were there that needed to stay open. So we delivered a program really quite successfully, and a lot of those businesses are still operating because of that. But I think they're all starting to roll again. I wish I had better answer for you. Lots of them sustainable. Sure.
So I know there are like issues with like internet connectivity in rural communities, but how do you find that like the digital space is maybe changing how Indigenous people are interacting with the economy?
Yeah, I remember when I used to deliver lending back in the 90s, Industry Canada had Connecting Canadians as a major program. It's like that last mile, and it was something that was pumped hard. But there's so many complexities. The same with boil water advisories and the water cleansing systems that they have. Sometimes it's just the government that makes everything so complex, whereas there's simpler systems that could be utilized, right? I thought that there would be some value in making sure that Starlink was one of those systems that we could allow those communities that don't have connectivity to connect really quickly. I think a lot of them have taken up that. I know I'm on it. It works really well, and I think a lot of those communities that have been disconnected, they've had satellite system programs. They've had all kinds of things that have improved connectivity for the communities, and they continue to do that with fiber optics. So eventually, everybody will get hooked up. It's just some of the ones that are really out of the way that aren't. I think Starlink would be a great connection, and I've been actively looking for somebody that knows the guy that owns it. We'll do something with that. Yep.
So you brought up like the community a lot. I'm just curious, do you support Indigenous-owned businesses outside of the community?
Of course, half of our lending is outside of the community. 50% of our lending is on reserves. So we go where the Indigenous person is and where they actively have their businesses. But in the urban community, I remember I used to work in Toronto downtown. We don't have an office in downtown Toronto, but I think we're sort of expanding our service areas to ensure that we're able to give out loans everywhere they are. But I think the problem was we didn't have enough capital to give everybody a loan that they wanted it. So you can't market yourself too extensively if you got no money to give. That's just creating false expectations. So now that we have the capital, now we're going to be able to market to everybody that wants to start a business. And that was one of the things I didn't want to do. I didn't want to raise expectations. We don't have enough programming to go around. So it was basically word of mouth for a lot of the lending that we used to do. Yeah.
You talked a lot about how like the creation of the reserves and communities sort of fractured a lot of communities. So you're seeing business ventures and projects sort of reconnecting certain communities and seeing partnerships between communities?
Oh yeah, for sure. When you have a catchment of communities, they're essentially from the same nation. So they're already connected anyways. So economic development corporations are the largest growing sector in our economy. And communities are just getting, it's like low-hanging fruit. Transportation, airlines, grocery stores, all these things that their communities are actively needing. It's an easy place to start a business. So that's what they're doing all across Canada. So we're seeing a really big uptake in those areas. And I want to be able to make sure that we have access to capital in all sectors for all needs so that we have a whole suite of financing available from around the world. Banks aren't the only way. Social impact investors, I forget what it was, is $25 trillion available in investment globally, something like that. I don't have the number, but there's a lot of money out there. They're just looking for pathways in, because I think the only sector in all the world that investment capital can't get to is the Indigenous community, because nobody knows how to do it, right? I think there was a fund that was started, it's called the Cape Fund, more than 30 years ago. Paul Martin had started it. It was $50 million, and they wanted to deploy it into the Indigenous community, and they thought it was going to be easy. But it's very complex in the Indigenous community. There's politics, there's due diligence, there's communities that you have to engage and make sure they're on board. There's lots of complexities. And the people that can be good at that will be able to deploy money. So we're still making those connections to this day. Hey.
Kind of going off of the question we talked about earlier about technology, I was
Okay.
wondering if you could speak to the effectiveness of social media and the role that can play in supporting the Indigenous economy.
I think it's probably been the biggest uptake for business development at the small entrepreneurial level. that I've seen. Like TikTok is huge in our community. We have crafters that are able to market directly to the world, and we have all kinds of educational people on there. I'm on there just talking about prosperity, and I just sort of do the day-to-day of what a CEO does, going to meetings, going to this, my meetings on the Hill, and put little snippets here and there and everything. But yeah, we have a lot of people that are on Instagram, that are on Facebook. Facebook is huge in the Indigenous community, but they're starting to transfer over to TikTok. So technology is huge. I don't know how fast AI is being uptaked. I think it's probably going to always lag behind what everybody else is doing until they see that the benefits are there and how it's going to help them. So I'm sure you guys use ChatGPT here. I started using it too, and I was like amazed at how fast the research got done. So you guys are probably going to be using that quite a bit. Yeah.
You mentioned the Galway Hub.
Yep.
What is that?
So the Indigenous, the Adaway Business Hub is essentially the model of what I'd like to see all our other Indigenous financial institutions put in place in their own communities, because having a place where entrepreneurs can go and work on their business plan and have a resource available, that's been shown to be successful in the past, but sustainability, financing, the day-to-day has not always been there. So by having it in this model, that it'll be supported by philanthropic giving, will ensure that it's a perpetual sort of growth area. So they do incubate. They have an incubator program where they're accelerating some Indigenous businesses to expand their revenue streams. And they just had the first graduation. We've had it for more than a year. We've got about 250 to 280 members now. That's just in the Ottawa region alone. So we're hoping that that kind of model is expanded across Canada. And we're partnered with DMZ, and they're the Metropolitan University out of Toronto, and they do it around the world. So we've got a good partner, and we want to make sure that we keep on expanding that, because now imagine connecting all those hubs together. You got perpetual access to, classes and podcasts and everything that an entrepreneur needs. Yeah, and it started off here, and it's because I had the space. It's what I've always wanted. I always wanted a space for entrepreneurs to be able to feel safe. And because we're driving procurement with the government, we wanted a place for everybody from across Canada to come have their meetings with government officials right in our space. Yeah.
I was really interested in what they're talking about private company investments, but how did you get them to that?
Well, there's a lot of capital in this world, right? Like I said, I think I was at Harvard taking a course, and they had $30 billion endowment, and they're looking for places to put their money. There's a lot of funds that are around this world that are buying up businesses, flipping them, trying to get their interest and make some money from things, and they're running out of places to make money. But the Indigenous community is that untapped place. Forgot the question again.
Oh, it was just about how you're getting the private company.
Oh, okay, yes. I have a goal of $500 million for our fund. It's at 153 million right now. We had Square, it's Square. It was called Block now, but they invested $3 million just to do something. I think a lot of corporations are wanting to do something more in the Indigenous community, and an easy place to participate is by giving us money that we can put to work. And so I've already got a lineup of investors that want to put money into our fund if we can deploy the first tranche of 153 million. Our organization is just in the process of sorting we've been giving loans at this level for 30 years, and now we can go up to here. Okay, we just have to get some stuff in order, and so they're in that process. But I anticipated in about 10 years to be a $500 million fund, and it'll just keep on going around. I made it evergreen, so usually funds open and close, and then investors know exactly what they're going to make on what kind of projects and so they know exactly what they're doing. This one's a revolving one. Investors can buy out, new ones can come in. We can increase the size of it based on kind of investment levels that we have. So, yeah.
We've got time for 2 more questions, and then we'll let Shannin.
Okay, how about just for your work that you're going to do, telling the story, connecting to people, any questions around that? who are you going to actively reach out to
What are you struggling
with your
right
stuff?
now?
Yeah, what are you struggling with?
You're starting to think about ideas. Like, be honest with Shannon. What are you struggling with?
We don't have really an in as much. We have a little bit of an into our community, but like not a lot.
So to know who's who? To know who's who? So I'll just, that one there, I like that one because there's only so many Indigenous organizations in the country that do certain work. We do financing, micro and small business. There's another organization that does capacity development for major projects so that communities can understand that. So you will understand based on a new organization we're creating, which is called the Indigenous Economic Council, who's who in the zoo. And then that'll be something that you can reach out to. So we're creating those connectors for you, and it'll be your judgment call on who's going to be your contact and the person that's going to give you the other side of the story.
What are the things that piss you off when a reporter calls you?
Shit. It all depends, I suppose. I think a lot of them don't really understand our community, first of all, and I'm fine with that, and I'll give them an update on it. But it's there's already a narrative that's already written before they even talk to you. I think that's what mostly it is, and that's what really comes out in the writing. So I don't really, they're not upfront with what kind of story they're trying to write, which will support them. So you're thinking they're going to do an objective overview of this story, and then a lot more of your points are going to be made. But then if it's one darn quote, you know that they're trying to just sell one thing. That's one thing that pisses me off. Yeah.
I'm gonna say one thing about the who's who. It's more like if I'm gonna call the front desk of the center and the community, like who should I be asking for that would best know or could show us, our group, the ins and outs of the community, the history, what's been going on. Like, who's that point person we should look for?
Well, I think because there's 634 and they're all at varying levels of capacity and development and everything. So it's all going to depend on who you're dealing with. And there's really only two point people that are able to speak for the community. That's the chief and deputy chief. Sometimes they have a media person, sometimes they don't. But those are the entry points to the community, if not some of their staff that are delegated to represent and tell the story for the community. Yep.
What about what's the word again? I forget what the word is. Like, it's not heritage. It's like. Do you remember?
TEK, traditional ecological knowledge. Yes. So everybody's delegated. Somebody's delegated in each community to speak to that, to provide a input into the world view of that community and a specific thing. So that's the person that you'd reach out to, and if that's the angle of your story, then you'd go through the band office and do that. If not, the tribal council represents a collective of communities, and they also have actively people that are there to be able to speak to those kinds of things. If anything, they have somebody that's specific to that area.
I think Maud has one last question.
If we have time?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. When reporting specifically on Indigenous communities, what ethical considerations do journalists need to be mindful of before arriving there, specifically to avoid perpetuating stereotypes or misrepresenting anybody?
I do a little bit of research on the community. If there's anybody that you know that's from that region, let's say you're going to James Bay and you know me, and you know Duncan, and you can just ask, okay, who's who in the zoo? Then you can reach out to those people so you can find out a little bit more, maybe historical research, and ask ChatGPT what's going on, just to get a good understanding. The one thing the communities really dislike is people to fly in and fly out, because they don't see the authenticity in that. It's almost better to come in and spend some time, especially if it's a bigger story. Spend some time, stay a few nights, meet some people, because in every community there's always a faction of people that are big talkers. Like, I'm not saying they're negative, but they're the ones that you want to find. They'll be able to tell you the real story, rather than just speaking to a certain segment of the community. You'll be able to find a little cross section.
Probably asking after we're I'm actually looking for a volunteer, someone that might be able to walk Shannon down the Broadway to Vancouver. That would be fantastic. Can you join I want you guys to thank Shannon for taking time. He's incredibly busy. He's helping so many of our entrepreneurs, and but he's made time for you guys today. And I think there's a lot to process there, and we'll talk about that after you get going on. And this is just a small token of
Thank you.
appreciation from us here at Carleton.
No, thank you very
so
much. Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Big wish.
Thank you.